It's
folks.
Bonnie, me, and I see you, Mark, too. Thank you. We'll be brief. Thank you, Latoya.
No worries. All right. So Teresa, why don't you moderate the rest of the comments that you know all the folks who are.
Yes. So Bonnie's next.
Thanks, Latoya. Really wonderful talk. And the name Latoya, it has always stood out to me as very Black and very feminine. It was, they're very present when I was growing up. And I think that a lot of the race associations and gender associations are going to stick. But my question is, like, are we successfully changing the narrative? Yes, it's like, these are Black names, right? These are known as Black names. Are we changing the narrative now that it's becoming like a little more awareness, like Black-owned businesses support, women-owned businesses? And is that changing? Is it changing more just in certain parts of the U.S. and still like not even touching other parts of the U.S.? So that was one of my questions, just like, how are we doing with changing the narrative? And I also was curious about like, how do interracial children factor into this, and if you had any opinions on that. So those were my two questions.
Cool. All right, both really great questions. So the first one is changing the narrative, particularly like around Black names, but it's really, what value are you associating with the name versus what are you looking at from the person? Because really the narrative is around dropping your internal bias around it, right? In the same way that there's a bias against, particularly in computer science, female sounding names versus male sounding names. As I believe it was, Dave, there we go. I believe it was Dave who brought that up about his friend who published, and then, people have a completely different perception. They're like, oh, you're an Asian female. I didn't expect this from this type of work. Why should there be any expectation about whose work it was if you didn't meet them? So in some ways, people are starting to be more aware, like, oh, let's support Black businesses. Let's do these things. What we see in civil rights, which is very concerning, is that there's normally a pendulum effect on great social change, right? Where we have these great periods of progress, and then you have a backlash period, right? So we had the 60s and the intervening 70s, and then you have the 80s where things really swung back. And then you have the 90s, and you have the O's, and you have the 10s, and now the 20s that are swinging back. And so maybe the 20s and the 30s will be okay, and then we'll swing back. So there's this idea that it's not even necessarily a narrative change, but more an undoing of the ideas that there was anything wrong with people with these names or people with this type of experience or background in the first place. And that's harder to get to, in the same way that there's been huge strides made in like the queer rights movement, right? Where it was like, before, you didn't even talk about it. Like, I remember watching television in the 90s, and Ricky Vasquez on My So-Called Life was like the biggest, like the only representation of a teen gay character. Now, like, that's okay. It's a lot more standard in all the pop culture that you see. It's normalized. But does that mean that things are better? Does that mean that all of these gains that were made are permanent? And what we're seeing in the political environment is these things can be rescinded, and these things can slide backward quicker than we know. So for me, it's about kind of letting go of the underlying beliefs, right? So again, when I grew up, Latoya was very strange. Now, like, oh yeah, his name is Shaquan, and people don't even blink sometimes when they say it. I think some of that is time, and some of that is people just letting go and being like, oh, these pieces are different. In terms of mixed race children, so there's a lot of really, really interesting that happened. The Racialicious actually was called Mixed Media Watch when it was run by Carmen Van Kerkhove, who's a good friend of mine, who's now Thomas Sanovi, and Jen Chow. And they talked about mixed race issues. First, they started on this blog called Eurasian Nation, which is about being mixed Asian and white. And then they kind of went over to Mixed Media Watch because they felt like there was still a lot of entrenched bias and different types of dynamics that they felt like were harmful to advancing racial justice and racial equality. So they started their own space in a different way. Carmen also ran this thing called Swirl, which was an on-campus organization of support for mixed race kids. And so I don't think there's anything inherently special about interracial marriage. And I say this very specifically, not that it's not a beautiful thing, but that people tend to look at it as kind of like this Trojan horse. If we keep intermixing, or they would old school call race mingling, or if we keep having more kids, everybody will be slightly more beige, and we'll just kind of breed our way out of racism. And that is actually not what happens at all. At all. It's not even close. Carmen used to run this series on the website called I Can't Be Racist, I Had Interracial Sex. That was all these things that people had said or done, even while they had partners of their color, even if they had children. We saw this at the Republican National Convention, where that woman got on stage and said, oh, statistically, my black son is going to commit crimes more than my white sons. Whoa. Number one, somebody save that kid. Number two, what is happening in your house? Is it apartheid in there? Is your child living in the basement drinking purple Kool-Aid and the other kids get to go to school? Like what? Why would that be the outcome you would assume for your son? You should not be adopting kids, lady, but we saw this all the time. We had series on racial issues about this. So there's no silver bullet out of racism outside of interrogating our own thoughts and beliefs and removing them, and then trying not to pass on anything that we have determined as harmful to the next generation, right? So it's like, I think I used to hate the word tolerance, and now seeing how things have gone into 2020, I'm kind of like, we can bring tolerance back, where you don't have to like it. It's a thing that's happening with somebody else, and that's okay. Maybe we were going for acceptance, but maybe we should bring back tolerance in this era and just be like, it's not for me, but you can do that. And I feel like we're in a much better place as a society if we can get there. So in terms of, it's much better because when you interrogate the ideas that lead to interracial relationships, right? There's interesting things. Some of it is revolutionary action. So my friend Anna Holmes, who is biracial, which she describes as one black parent, one white parent. So there's even like a bunch of fissures within the mixed race community that I cannot necessarily speak to, but has been very interesting to watch over these years around kind of like who was determined by what, how do people feel about it. There are people who have parents who are like, well, you're really more white, so don't, this is my Asian kid, this is my white kid. There's a lot that goes with these things that are within family dynamics that you don't know. That said, I think the interesting thing that we can learn in particular from interracial relationships is how far we still actually have to go between like that barrier of fetish. So like right now, what you see with teenagers is there's a lot more interracial relationships, right? In a way that it was not when I was growing up. There's a lot more stay to your side. Now it's a lot more mixed, but is it really if, the white girls are calling themselves snow bunnies and young black men are saying, well, I don't date black girls because I think they're dirty. White girls look so much better. Did we really make progress in this case? If that's what the thought pattern is, right? Stuff on TikTok can be disturbing. Sometimes it's just like, this is how y'all feel, my God. So the idea more is, again, dismantling these pieces, right? Any interracial relationship, just like any other relationship, is a unique story to itself of how people came together, what it was. I was telling Anna's story. So in Anna's perspective, her parents met at a civil rights march, right? So to them and to her, she was kind of the embodiment of the ideal they were trying to go for. That's a lot to put on a kid, right? Because she's not racial harmony in a box. She's just Anna. She's just trying to be herself. So getting to a place where I think people within families and external to families are willing to interrogate whatever their own beliefs are and to try not to push any further harmful beliefs onto their own children to let people make their own choices, I think is a little bit more helpful than kind of that, what it feels like kind of foolishly optimistic, like, at some point we'll all just, leave racism because enough of us will be in interracial relationships. You can still hold very harmful ideas inside of these structures. We see it every single day. And the idea is to be actively trying to dismantle them so that your kids have a better life. And that's, I think, the thing that was most disturbing, particularly when Carmen would surface some of these stories. There's one right now happening. It's very controversial about a woman who's a vlogger. So she monetizes based on her kids and family life. And she has 4 white children, and she adopted a child and then broke that adoption. It was transracial adoption, and just disappeared the child. And there's this huge internet uproar, in part because she monetized like this child. They felt like the child was more of a play for views than actually wanting the child. It was more like, I'm a good person versus, what happened. So the child disappearing was very concerning to a lot of people because they didn't address it until, until internet outcry. But there's a lot of different dynamics that are happening. So I think a lot of it is around just kind of being vigilant and then also helping people to realize that they can have different types of, you can have different types of relationships without trying to put a halo or denigrate them. It can just be a relationship. And I think that's the ideal that we're trying to get to. This can just be a relationship.
Thank you so much. And I just want to comment that I could relate to a lot of what you said. I mean, I'm actually mixed race, and there's the white side of my family and the Asian side of my family. And I also can actually see how it played out, that there was racism inherent in my parents, even though they were married. That my dad got put into playing a certain role and my mom got put into playing another role, partly due to race, as well as political beliefs manifested on different sides of the family differently, depending on how white or colored you were. So, and that's just Eurasian, you know, so really, really good point. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons. Again, they're not my stories, so I try not to like do those things. But like I said, being adjacent to Carmen for all those years, because she's, you know, Belgian Chinese, and looking at the ways, and even like the ways that people would say things within her family. Oh, you got the white nose from your dad. Like, you don't fit this beauty standard. You got this. Like, it's a really interesting way that, again, these dynamics go between families in some ways. So again, it's like, the idea is that this just is, right? Like, again, times like, it is. It just is. There's not, this relationship is. This child is, as opposed to making them a symbol for the things that we think they are.
Thank you.
Okay. Who else did we have, Teresa? I've lost track. I don't remember.
I know Umar was there. Teresa, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's just me quickly and Umar, two more.
15 more minutes, people still have questions. Like, that's, you know, if you're going to write a question, well, we can hard stop at 2:30, or I can hang for a few more minutes if we want to get to the rest of the questions. Remember, okay. So who else had questions?
So, number one, I wanted to say to you that what you just mentioned about the zip code, the marketing demographic footprint, and color of skin, how it affects how we see each other, and even the names. This is everywhere in the world. We think that, you know, this is over here alone. And Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, actually talks about that very clearly. And she says how, simply put, that race, culture, and economics are like blood, like bone, skin, bone, blood, and skin. So it was just really interesting and popped my mind open to how we see things and how we see each other. And coming back to the Heart Sutra that you were talking about in the beginning, Heart Sutra technically is just saying that we're all one, we're all connected. If we, you know, we are bad towards each other, the effect goes outwards to other people too. And simply put, that's what the Heart Sutra is saying, that we're all connected. The question that I wanted to ask you is, how can we organize and go out and do something? We can talk about it as much as we want to, about culture and all this stuff, but what are the steps that we can actually take as an organization to actually be a part of the bigger community, so that we can actually be able to help other people? That's what I wanted to ask you.
Amazing. All right, excellent question. So 2 big things that I normally recommend every single time. So I was like, what are the concrete actions we can take? Because each place has a different history, right? And just as you mentioned globally, right? Like when we were on Racial Issues, we posted a link one time about something happening in Malaysia, and the heretofore, you know, Malaysian minority, we'd never heard from Malaysia, was like, oh no, the Chinese act like this, you guys don't understand, it says to be like this. It became like a 4-day conversation. We were like, wow. Mm-hmm. So these dynamics exist all over the world. They're just, again, race is a social construct, right? It only exists essentially based on the history and the border that you're in. As soon as you change your location, it changes. The context will change. The dynamics are the same. In terms of what you can do. So one of the things that we would say, and like back to kind of the interracial relationship conversation, people tend to focus on interracial relationships in terms of family units, and particularly like specific types of romantic pairings. But we found that the thing that got people the most engaged about racial justice and social justice was interracial friendships, was that power of a friend, where you're not looking at them in the ways in which the filter that comes in when it's like a romantic or lust situation, but it is a friend. And people who tend to be the most dedicated to racial justice, like it was funny, we used to have a joke, there was a profile of like a white person that was really into racial issues, and they were normally a person that grew up with, around, or were very close to a person of color without being like related to them, or without possibly being related to them. So, you know, a good friend of mine, she had a stepsister who was Korean. Another good friend had a college roommate who was Black. And you get to observe a portion of somebody's life without, you know, any real investment. You don't have to, you're not trying to get them to do something with you outside of being friends. They get to see what their life is like and have the trust built up in that relationship to ask questions openly. And what you find with a lot of adults in particular is that our social circles become more and more closed as we get older. You're not encountering and meeting people in the same ways that you were when you were younger. For various reasons, college, enlistment, military travel, you know, as you get older, you kind of segment a little bit more. You're not meeting as many people. And then your social circles become smaller. And so a lot of times people are like, I'm having issues with recruitment. I'm having issues with, you know, finding diverse candidates for this role or recruiting more diversity. I think it's, okay, how many friends of other races do you have in your social circle? And how many of these are like real friendships, deep friendships? A good friend of mine, Eve, on Twitter was talking about, like, in this cultural moment, a lot of people want to have conversations about race and they feel like they don't have anybody they can go to. So they're asking their coworkers. And Eve just posted this tweet very casually. She didn't think it was going to blow up. And she was just like, look, I mean, for a lot of you, if you have what you would call a black friend and you guys haven't had a conversation about race, you guys aren't real friends. Sorry to tell you, right? And that tweet, she got to retweet and be like, look, guys, I'm not going to do a flow chart for you to figure out if this black person you talk to because of work or other reasons is your actual friend. Like, this is something you need to figure out for yourself. But friendship does require, a deeper friendship, does require a level of trust and allows you to share and talk about your experiences. One of my close friends is Korean. And we've had lots of conversations around why there's divisions. She is on the opposite pole as I am from immigration. I had no idea why. Like, why would you be this way? She was, well, my family had to wait. Why should other people skip the line? We have had those direct conversations because we have trust, because we have long-term friendship. It allows me to understand her beliefs and figure out what's going on, and she understands my beliefs and, you know, and the ways in which we've segmented, particularly, like, you know, in DC. And it's interesting, we look at class dynamics, right? Lower income Asian Americans and lower income African Americans tend to live in very close proximity and do things. And then it becomes like kind of like this merchant class thing that we talked about, or the sandwich class. It's the whole thing. But these stories can be known because we are in such close proximity. It is social circles that keep us apart. Right, so we're going to the same schools, we're eating the same stuff, we live in the same housing complex, but we don't interact because we're not friends, right? If you are friends, you start breaking through those barriers. You see other types of things. It never occurred to me, again, I mentioned that Silver Spring, Maryland used to be on like the most diverse cities list. It didn't occur to me that other black people weren't going to H Mart or Lotte Plaza and getting like little star lollipops, or your friends giving you some mooncake because it's Chinese New Year. It didn't occur to me that people didn't have that perspective. Right? It was just very, you know, you don't think about it. You're in school. Somebody sat next to you. They gave you a pencil. You gave them something else. But that friendship helps you to break down those barriers that the illusion is trying to create. The illusion is saying, well, this person's going to act this way. These type of people do this. These type of people are a threat because of the coronavirus. They're spreading the virus because of their weird habits. And when you sit there, you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Right? That's not what's happening. But you have that reference and framework because you have these deeper relationships. So I would say, go make new friends. That's the first thing I always say. Try to make a friend that is outside of your circle, that is outside of your racial background, that is different from you, that you guys can find something else in common. The second thing I would say is, particularly for people of privilege, to advocate very actively. And if there is something that makes you feel uncomfortable, to interrogate that. So I grew up in a school system, like I said, that was very segregated, and they tried to desegregate it. But richer parents always found a way to kind of shield resources for their kids over everyone else. And that's apparently still happening. I was looking in like the high school, I'm in the newspaper, in the Washington Post from like 1999, talking about the disparities at my high school. And now the high school up the street has had this entire referendum on race because the same stuff is happening, 20 plus years later. The same stuff is happening. The same dynamics occur because essentially rich parents start trying to hoard. You see this now with what's happening with COVID. And there's people, oh, we have pods. We'll just do pods. We'll figure stuff out. A lot of my friends in the Bay Area have left. They're like, I'm just going to be in Hawaii for this part. But who can you advocate on behalf of that doesn't have the same time or resources or understanding the systems that you have? Because it has to be you as a person that's like, hey, I am a voting participant in this area. And I feel like since we have an excess of school funding, we should give some of that to the school down the road. I am in this area and I feel as though this homeless situation is ridiculous. What is going on with the zoning for multifamily units? What is going on with the zone, how are we allowing new development without putting in affordable housing? Because what's normally happening is the people who are opposed are the ones who are the most vocal. The people who are like, oh, you can't bring, all these addicts into my neighborhood. You can't do these things. It's so terrible, right? Like you can't, those people will bring crime, all these other things. What happens, and particularly if you start studying patterns of gentrification, what happens is they tend to take all the low-income people and jam them in one area. It's away from everybody else, away from those opportunities, like I said in that report that I showed earlier, away from all of those pieces, and say, okay, just make it work. You're just in this, and everyone's afraid, like, oh, now there's all this crime, and there's this. And if we let these kids in our community, they will act the same way. And what happens under a more distributed model, which is what they were following when I was going through school, is that they're not pockets of poverty anymore, right? There are little places, but they're like, okay, we're going to make a mixed-use development. And these are going to be the full-price ones. These are going to be affordable housing. This is going to be Section 8. This is going to be veterans housing, right? This is what we're going to make. And from there, we're allowing this many families to come in. And what you've done is you've allowed the opportunity for a family that be mired in those same kind of forces that inflict poverty and create these cycles of poverty to have access to something outside of it. And if you're willing to be slightly uncomfortable, there's a lot of interesting stuff, particularly start looking at gentrification, around noise complaints and how those are the early hallmarks of forcing people, particularly lower income people, out of communities that they've called home 25, 30 years. My good friend Lam is a data journalist for BuzzFeed. And she has this beautiful data visualization of an apartment complex in New York, where she tells the story of, like, this was a formerly low income area, mostly Black and Latino. The residents of that place had a 30-year-long Friday night standing dominoes tradition. They would go out, hang out in the streets, and play dominoes. And they've been doing so for 30 plus years. No problems, no incidents. A luxury high-rise was erected 2 blocks away from them. And suddenly there was this spike in public nuisance calls. Public nuisance calls, by law, have to be responded to by the police. So they're coming out now. These 50, 60, 70-year-old abuelos are getting arrested for playing dominoes, because they've been doing their whole lives. They're going to jail. Families are having to increase police presence. All the things that are happening because of these noise complaints that are coming from people who came to the neighborhood and did not understand it or know it or want to particularly be friends with people who are there, right? And this is in New York, which is known for its diversity. And so Lam actually charted the 311 calls, the ones that were coming in, and found out not only could, I think there were 400 calls traced to the same apartment building over the course of a year, but more than 200 of the calls originated from the same floor. The assumption is it's the same person. Mm-hmm. Calling and then from there creating havoc in this community that had a flow and had a dynamic, because this person doesn't like the noise of the dominoes party that happens on Friday nights. A lot of resistance, again, I feel like there's some kind of, I'm not going to know it well enough. I feel like there was some kind of Buddhist phrase about the resistance being in yourself. I feel like there's something there. I don't know. It's been a while since I looked at any kind of text. But, the biggest change is within yourself, right? What am I willing to be uncomfortable with in order to make somebody else's life better? Mm-hmm. That's a question most of us do not ask. And it's a really tough thing. Am I willing to be slightly uncomfortable for someone else's life to be better? Among my friends, we had a bunch of friends who did not go to high school with us because the high school was considered too ghetto, and their parents were like, nope, pulling you, we're putting you in this more segregated school. And it's interesting because the white friends who continued on to the diverse high school, right, generally maintained more diverse social groups over time than the ones that were pulled out and isolated and sent to another school. Mm-hmm. They only stay friends with maybe us who they remember. And these are the ways that these things start, right? So again, what if my friend Jessica's mom had been like, I'm a little uncomfortable with Jessica going to this school, but maybe I should try to figure out why. What are her friends? What is she going to learn? What will be different? Okay. My son has a very different life than I do. I'll say this last thing and we'll get back to you. My son has a very different life than I do, or I did when I was growing up. So he's very privileged. But as a result, I try to send him and support the neighborhood schools around me, right? Because if you don't support your neighborhood schools, if you keep sending your kids to private school charter or whatever, because you can afford to do so, your neighborhood schools don't improve. You've got to be there. But what was interesting was people would keep attacking me because they would assume because a lot of the kids were low income at his school. And so, they would just assume that every single parent in the school was low income. I mean, you know, by numbers makes sense. So they would do things like, here's a recipe to try to get more vegetables. Here's kale salad. You guys try kale salad. One time, this woman kept asking me every single day. She was like, did you sign up for your food stamps? And I was like, ma'am, no, I didn't sign up for that. Did you sign up for food stamps? No, I didn't sign up for food stamps. She was like, ma'am, you need to sign up for food stamps. I was like, I work at ESPN. We're not, this is not, my son is here. But, you know, but the wonderful thing, because I didn't go to, you know, the bougie or private school that a lot of people in my neighborhood went to instead of the hood one. My son spoke 3 languages before he was 2. It was really weird for me because he would come home and he could be speaking Amharic, Spanish, or whatever, because his 2 best friends were Ethiopian and Latino. It was like Lou and I forgot Lou and Julian. And they just made this little baby language where they were just using the words that were the most convenient. And so he would just yell, sometimes it'd be Spanish, sometimes he would be like, leche. I'm like, okay, you want milk? Or what do you need, baby? Like, okay, let me help you. But he wouldn't have had that experience not at that school. And so, you know, the language that I normally hear from other parents is fear, right? My kid's going to lose out if they're in this lower income school, if they're in this diverse school, and not gain. Look at this perspective that my kid is getting. You know, sometimes it's not a good perspective, right? My son came home and was like, you know, my friend keeps asking for all this food. I need to pack more food in my lunchbox. And you're like, oh, your friend is hungry. Oh, okay. And have a conversation. Maybe everybody's family doesn't have enough money for food. So it's really good to share more if you can. So I just started packing double snacks so that he could share with his friend. Because I was like, why is my kid like coming home hungry, giving him a full lunch? And it's like his friend wasn't getting food at home, so he was giving him half. But it's important to see those things when you're young so you know that other people are having different experiences, and that does not make them less, right? I grew up as one of those kids that was low income, free lunch. They call it farms now. And people were afraid to have their kids in school with me, right? I don't want my child to have that. So keep going. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No. I was just shocked that, you know, sometimes nothing surprises me, but sometimes when people say something catches me and it surprises me, but it just like, for me, it's just like, you know, I come from a third world country and from Pakistan, and I've seen everything from, you know, from meat being, you know, raw meat being dragged across the streets to people being shot, and from palaces being built over here and all over the world. And it's just, you know, it's like nothing seems to surprise me. It's more of the, you know, it's like, oh, I've seen this before. But the reason why I was asking was that it's just, so in essence, what we need to do is start reaching out and using our voice for advocating change. And that is the best way to do things, and look for more and more opportunities to reach out from our comfortable areas and really get uncomfortable. That's what you're saying, in essence. Yeah.
I mean, so think about it this way. For a lot of you guys, right, you have made some level of educational attainment. You have some level of financial security, right? Mm-hmm. Is there a kid in East Palo Alto that you just don't know that can't afford a graphing calculator, which means you cannot go to higher level sciences? I have a whole other talk I did about this, by the way, in Sciences and Math, about the ways in which kids get tracked. And like a TI, I had to save up for 6 months to get a TI 83, algebra. Couldn't afford tutors or any of those things. But again, like to somebody else, like $80, nothing, right? Mm-hmm. But the gap exists because we don't necessarily know that our neighbor is suffering this way, that our friend is suffering this way. And you start finding your path based on what it is, right? I was like, there's so many paths into the work of racial justice. So I always like the thing that you do is pick the thing close to you, right? Pick the thing that's close to you, because that's the thing that you can keep and kind of keep close to. A lot of times it's as easy as volunteering at your local library, because a library, right? A library is a fantastic transformative space in society. It's so radical, right? Everything is free. There is no place where everything is free. You can go to the library and everything is free. I can print for free. I can use a computer for free. I can get books for free. The library is my area. We're doing English language conversation clubs, tax prep, job prep, right? We had like dancers. They had everything because they knew they needed to support the community, right? So if you volunteer at your library and you hang out long enough, you start noticing, we get a lot of homeless people at 3 p.m. every Wednesday. What's going on? Oh, they do street cleaning, fill out everybody's tents. What? And everybody's like freaking out. So they go to the library because it's safe and they won't get arrested. Whoa, is that something we're supposed to be doing? Why are they doing this? Is there a more compassionate way to handle this? And then you know, if you're a homeless person, you're like, screw you, get off the street. You're like, hey, I'm a tax-paying citizen and a voter. Excuse me, you're going to listen to me. And they do. So again, like, just kind of, I'm always like, start where you are, because there's so many different ways that you can impact all kinds of lives that are just right next to you. It's just about being more aware that it's happening. It's in the world. It's here. You just have to be aware.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Do you have any other questions, Teresa, or are we wrapping up? What are we doing?
Well, I was going to ask you, but you kind of answered already. It was related to what Umar was asking, and I was going to ask you about, you know, East Palo Alto, since we are so close, yes. But you have already answered my question. Yeah. I think Dave has probably what should be a final question, because we are already over time. Right. I just wanted to say that I'm.
Question too. I feel like I saw your hand early on. Maybe not.
Who?
Brenda.
Oh, Brenda? Oh, sorry, I didn't see Brenda. Brenda, then
Brenda and
yeah.
Dave.
Please, Brenda, because she hasn't asked a question.
Gosh, I'll be quick. What was I gonna? Oh, it seems like one of the things, like, I was thinking about your family being, you know, that your cousins were 3 miles apart, going to a different school and a different neighborhood, but your family. So I'm wondering about the role of, you know, family values. It sounds like your family was trying to get you into that best school and they weren't quite sure how to do it, but they were obviously valuing education and exposure to a different scenario. And what do you think the importance of the family, you know, is?
Excellent question. I actually write a lot about my family, or I used to write a lot about my family. Then I was like, it was exposing them in really weird ways when I started becoming more popular or like more followed. So I stopped writing about my family because they didn't ask me to be more famous and for people to judge their past choices, which is what happens when you write about stuff on the internet. But I'm happy to talk about it here because it is really fascinating. And I've wondered that, especially because I'm a part of a set of 3 different kids that was born in '83. We all had different parents, but our parents did have those very different life experiences and values. All of our parents were teenagers. So my mom is 16 years older than me. My cousin Sharika, her mom is 16 years older than her. My cousin Ricardo, his mom is 17 years older than him, right? And we were all born in 1983. Ricardo's parents were on drugs, so they were on, it was during the crack era in DC. They were on crack cocaine, really, really heavily. Sharika's parents didn't have drugs. So Sharika is my cousin, and so my Uncle Terry's daughter, and then he had a wife named Marjorie. They were just very young and had very different and more materialistic values than everybody else, which is interesting. So they were really trying to get out to like make more money and to like be more famous, right? And my parents my dad had enlisted in the military. So they had a very contentious relationship about the time that I came about. And then my dad was in Lebanon when there was a lot of bombings. They had taken out an embassy and killed the Marines. So there was a lot of traumatic stuff that happened to him. So he came back and developed a drinking problem. Which actually alcoholism runs in the family. So there's values, but also addiction. So my dad's value was always hard work and working your signature, but his addiction prevented him from figuring those things out. So my parents' relationship was very tumultuous. When we split up, my mom, who had grown up in the area that I grew up, was like, I need to get back here away from DC where my kids can be more safe. So that's where we went, right? My cousins, so everybody was more or less poor. So we're all on like Section 8 housing. There's a lot of restrictions that come when you live when you're poor. The government is very involved in your day-to-day affairs. One of the ways that people tend to lose their kids to the system is by having a dirty house. It's a really interesting thing. Like if you're rich and you're messy, nobody cares. If you're poor and your house is messy, you're considered an unfit parent, and they can remove your child and put them into child protective services, in which they will then, because you are poor, go pay another family to foster your child. So if you're in foster care, they normally pay foster parents from the state like $2,000 to $4,000 a month to offset the cost of rearing a child, but they do not give to poor parents. So like these dynamics were very familiar to me because my friends were in them, right? It wasn't until I was an adult that I was able to like put the pieces together. Like, so one day, you know, I had a really good friend that was close to me, and we were all going to the same place. Her mom was addicted to crack cocaine as well. So we would go to her house. Sometimes everything would smell like that plastic, horrible crack smell that I hate to this day. To this day, I smell it. I'm like, somebody's on drugs. I can't deal, right? But her mom was in and out of rehab. And so at some point, CPS had come and took all 3 children and assigned them different places. So my friend Dawn ran away. She moved in with her boyfriend. They were like 14 or 15 at the time. So she moved in with her boyfriend, like got a fake ID and just became an adult. I was like, I'm not going wherever they want me to go. We lost her. We've never found her. We've been looking for years. And then Jasmine was reassigned to a group home and ended up in Florida for some reason. And we were never able to figure out what happened to them after that. So these things, it's values, it's a state-based system, it's different stuff. My parents didn't particularly value education, which is interesting. Like my dad was they're tradespeople. So my mom was always like, oh, you should probably be a nail tech. You learn how to do nails, you can have a job and it'll be safe. You don't have to worry about college because college is hard. And she wasn't really paying attention to the fact that I was in like AP classes. They didn't care. They weren't going to parent-teacher conferences or anything. My dad was a journeyman electrician. So he was always like, learn a trade, learn a trade, learn a trade, so you'll always be able to eat. And so my cousin Ricardo, whose father had exited the picture a long time, his father was very abusive and a lot of really problematic stuff was happening. Ricardo was very close to my father and became an electrician, basically because my dad treated him to me, right? But it's, so some of it is values, some of it is what you get. Kids also learn values from the environment, right? So me growing up in Montgomery County, where my friend in school, her mom was a scientist. And I still remember this. It was like 3rd grade. Like, she's a scientist. So she came and brought like these mini tube tests, and you're like, you can be a scientist. You know, she's a mom who was a scientist, even cooler, right? Kristen, your mom's a scientist. You're like, yeah, that's what I do as a science person. Like, this is what I can, this is a job that you can have, right? And we have a big house where we have the latest Nintendo, we have a Saab, we can drive, and all of the cool stuff happens, you know? And I was like, what? Like, you know, I'm going back to this shitty apartment that everybody gets kicked out of all the time because you don't have the rent money. You can have this other kind of life. This is amazing, right? Whereas my cousins, everybody was poor and we were just fighting all the time. Like like I said, I told at the beginning of this story, like their schools were always closed. There was always this environment where there were no resources to be had, so everyone was fighting over crumbs. And you can't see that, like, oh, over here, like there's all this abundance that's around. And so the messages that we were getting in the abundant area was like, oh yeah, you can have this too, kids, just work hard. And go, do you need help going to college, go to career fairs? And none of those things were available to my cousins. None of those. It was not the same at all. They got military, if anything. And in the military didn't really want you if they felt like you were too much of a violent risk or too dumb, or like that's jarhead stuff, it's cannon fodder. So it's a very specific way that you're framed even. And so when I went to that, the best school in the low performing area that I talked about before, it was interesting to me that like in my high school that I came from, the military recruiters were in the career center, and it was very specific. Like you interacted with them if you were always like kind of going to, if you were always getting suspended or something like that, the military folks would come in and be like, have you thought about ROTC? But it was always like an offer. Like, oh, here, like, have you thought about the military as a career? Whereas when I went to this other school, the recruiters were in the hallways. They knew everybody by name. Like I had a friend named Graham. Graham had been flagged for that. They were like, oh, you're smart. You go to the Air Force. They had flagged Graham for the Air Force before he ever even thought about what he wanted to do in his life. You're going to go. And everybody else just kind of, they're like, well, I mean, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. So it's a really interesting piece. So you're like, yes, there's values, right? But kids learn values from all kinds of places, including their environment. And you even see there's an area near me called Prince George's County, Maryland, which used to be a very affluent Black enclave, which 2008 housing crisis really like crapped that out. But in PG, you have kids who are from very affluent families who don't really function. There's like that whole affluenza thing that you talk about a little bit more in these circles. They don't really function in the same way. They don't really have a lot of ambition, so they don't go anywhere. So it's a really interesting, weird economy because you get these values. Like, so even parents who have like put in like, oh, if you work hard, you know, my dad, like one of my friends, like his dad was a doctor and his mom was a lawyer. So she teased him like, oh, you have the Huxtable household, like a Cosby kid, right? And he lived in his parents' basement for like 30 years and didn't do anything to be a rapper because everything was comfortable. So it's I don't know. It's a weird question for me to try to answer because it's like, yes, values are a factor, but there's a lot of things that influence those values. There's a lot of things that influence how your family interprets those values, right? So like, you know, our joke with like my cousin Ricardo is a family man. He married his high school sweetheart. He has 4 kids. He's an electrician. He supports all his kids. He's like, I don't deal with this. And then when we go to like family gatherings, it's normally tense between us and the parents because we're like, well, y'all could have kind of done a little bit better than you did. Like, I understand why we're all adults now. We can see what happened. We still could have used a little bit more support here in the beginning times. But that's also your parents are teenagers and they get better over time. So the stuff that we remember as the 83 kids, my sister was born in 89, Ricardo's sisters and brothers were born in like 86 to 90. They had a different memory of the parents who then were like, oh, we should do more family stuff. Oh, we should try to be more stable. Oh, I'm trying to get a job. Now, the aunt that we remember as the person that would go on drug binges and leave the kids for months. Like my mom had taken care of my cousins for like 3 months because we just couldn't find the mom. Nobody knew what happened. And then if you're on Section 8, you actually get penalized by the government for that. Like if there's extra people in your house, you can lose your housing. So it's a really high tense situation. If you are poor and all your friends are poor and your family's poor and then something happens, like everybody has to pay the price in some way. So it was a big risk and we were always like trying to juggle that. Now that person is a grandparent and her daughters are mostly absent. So Ricardo made it. The other 2 sisters did not make it. They were in and out of jail. And so, you know, the grandma is now raising the kids she didn't raise the first time. But like those things happen. But again, like when you are in poverty, like one of the things they used to criticize from the media a lot is that they have this expectation that poor people are superhuman, where it's like you don't get tired and like you're doing all this stuff. Like there was this Washington Post article that I tore up one time where they were following this one kid who's like a young white kid who's low income. And they were like, you know, she's doing SAT prep and, you know, she's doing all this stuff. She's got this boyfriend that's driving her around. And as a person who was poor, I was like, the boyfriend is transportation. I don't know if she even likes it or not, but it's easier this way, like whatever. And they were like, yeah, and, you know, she works 2 jobs. And on the day of her SAT, she decided she was tired and didn't want to go. And how could she throw away her life like this? And it was like, bro, you just said she works 2 jobs. She's raising the other kids in the household. Life is stressful. Her friend just got killed. And you're like, oh, but she skipped the SAT. Well, she put herself on the fast track. Like, dude, yes, she did. If your child was rich, they would have been like, oh, you need some therapy? When you're poor, no, you don't get those things. Nobody tells you that stuff. Maybe when you're an adult, you'll get access to it. Maybe not. But these types of disparities are so deeply rooted. And again, it's like people like to say family values. Yeah, in some ways, but you can also see like people who have great family values, some of their kids don't turn out either. Like that, sometimes it's different. So it's a lot more, I think, influence journey based on these different pieces. But yes, that's how I would answer that question.
Hey, thank you. That was a beautiful answer. Thank you.
Yes.
Teresa.
Wonderful. I think we went half an hour over time. You've been very generous. I think we can finish it here. And I feel very fortunate to have you as a friend, Latoya. You are truly an inspiration, and it was a wonderful event. Everybody was very engaged. Thank you very much. I already got some private messages saying that we should invite you again.
Oh no, absolutely. Everybody's always like, "Oh, this is an hour." I was like, "We're talking about race. It's never going to be an hour." I always put my calendar. I'm like, "Oh, 3 o'clock, I'm going to be here." Because the same thing happens. Like we talk about it because there's so few places where you can have like a good, engaged conversation. People are, they just want to stand, you want to sit, you want to sort through it. But yeah, again, happy to come back again. Be fun to do some kind of exchange when the world reopens. You know. When the world opens.
Maybe you can come visit in person. I hope to go back at some point too.
Yeah, no, I'm on the board now, so I'm in Stanford twice a year.
Oh yeah, you can to Stanford now and then.
Normally, I'm around there, so it's like it's no big deal. I have a lot of friends that live there, but
right.
I'm happy to see the center too. Right, there's beautiful spaces all the way around. So yes, but thank you guys for your time and your attention and your care. And you know, this is again one of 8 million other conversations you could be having in the course of your life. So, you know, I would just say, just take the opportunity. Just take the opportunity.
I hope this is a moment of change.
We do too. It feels different this time, I have to say, because we can talk about every other summer and the names that came out, but this time it feels like a lot more people are paying attention and want to actually do something, right? Mm-hmm. Figure something out, read at least one other book. And again, it's a path, right? Everything's a path. You stepped on this path, steps have changed, you keep going. That's it. You're aware now. So now we can do something with it.
Right. And I really value the effort you made to make the Buddhist connection.
Oh yes. I find it fascinating. It's been years since I've read anything. Maybe I should go back and like look at it a little bit. Because like I said, there's a lot of wisdom in all different types of paths, all different walks, and so
yeah. I love the quote. I love the quote you chose. The quote.
Yeah. It just because I was like, I wanted to choose something from the Heart Sutra because that's the one that I know, and that's the one that's in Hardcore Zen. And then I was like, this doesn't really feel like it applies. And then I was like, just quickly Googling, like, what other sutra? I was like, this one is perfect. What sutra is this? So now I'm going to go back and do that one. But yeah,
beautiful.
Lots of wisdom all over. So anyway, thank you guys so much for being in practice, being present, and feel free to take this into the world. All right, take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you so very much.
Bye. It was nice to meet you. Hope you come back.
Mm-hmm.